Hello, and thank you for listening to the Geek Bubble. My name is John Cruz, and today I'm going to be talking about The Evil Within, the new game from acclaimed game designer Shinji Mikami. Before I go any further, I must warn you that this review will cover The Evil Within extensively, which will include summarizing major story spoilers and game mechanics. So, if you don't wish to be spoiled in any way, turn back now. This is your last warning. In The Evil Within, you play as Detective Sebastian Castellanos, a man investigating reports of violence at the Beacon Mental Hospital. Upon arriving, you discover that the entire staff of the ward has been slaughtered and those responsible are missing. While searching for clues, Sebastian is discovered by the killer and immediately knocked out. Upon awakening, Castellanos finds himself at the mercy of a monstrous butcher, a madman that he must escape. One of the things that immediately stands out about The Evil Within is how it spends barely any time pondering before it throws you straight into the metaphorical meat grinder. Most horror games spend at least 30 minutes building tension before actually presenting the horror elements to the player. Another horror game from 2014, Alien Isolation, spends over 2 hours slowly building tension before presenting any actual danger at all. The Evil Within's downtime clocks in at maybe 5 minutes. So, from here on out, the game relentlessly throws horrors of every shape and size at the player at a consistent pace. There's rarely any downtime, and when there is, the game instills thick layers of atmosphere to keep the player on edge. While this method of design might seem detrimental to the pacing, The Evil Within actually manages to be thoroughly engrossing. Shinji Mikami is a veteran in creating atmospheres based off of confined spaces and looming threats, but the atmosphere is never so terrifying that it becomes hostile towards the player. Instead, the game walks a tightrope of being both engrossing enough to warrant long play sessions and scary enough to actually create a sense of dread. However, Mikami's belief in what makes a horror game greatly differs from that of modern horror game design. If you look at something like Alien Isolation or even the more praised PT demo from Hideo Kojima, both those games share a similar design philosophy that has become prevalent over the past few years. The primary focus of both of those games is to scare the player. Creating a sense of dread and fear prevails over all things, even having fun. So, whether you like to admit it or not, PT is not fun. It's terrifying. You don't have a good time while playing PT, and that's far from a bad thing because instead of fun, that feeling is replaced with simulated fear, a feeling that can surprisingly be just as addicting. So for whatever reason, we like to be scared, and the most revered horror games of the past 5 years have recognized this, and they have cut away from any attempt to distract the player from being terrified. No fun, just fear. I've heard these games consisting of PT, Alien Isolation, and Amnesia: The Dark Descent called by the genre of horror simulator instead of horror game. I think the title is appropriate. Any game aspect of these titles, perhaps with the exception of Alien Isolation, is put on the back burner to emphasize the horror. The number one way all three of these games do this is by making the enemies invincible. If you can't fight the enemy, the only thing you can do is run. The classic horror games believed in giving the player little power. Modern horror games believe in giving the player no power, which is much, much scarier. This, along with many other things that I don't really have time to talk about, culminate in something that is simply terrifying. These games are truly scary, and they do everything in their power to achieve that effect. Shinji Mikami, however, is not interested in modern horror game design. He's not interested in that at all. However, I do assume that Mikami has been watching horror games over the past few years, and I guess he must know how scary horror games have become. He probably could have taken from the design mechanics of modern horror games, but that isn't what he wanted. In an interview, Mikami stated that he wanted to bring classic survival horror back, his type of horror back. However, it is in the first hour of The Evil Within that we see Mikami turn away from this. In what may be the most harrowing moment of the game, the player must escape from the clutches of this chainsaw-wielding foe with no weapons and a severed tendon. It's pretty intense stuff, and Mikami handles it like the master he is. And it's in these opening moments that Mikami introduces another element he's experimenting with. Much like modern horror games, The Evil Within features an option for stealth. To escape from this madman, the player must sneak away, throwing bottles as distractions, slinking from one box to another. It's an extremely effective mechanic, one that is gladly welcomed to the Resident Evil formula. Sadly, however, it's only in these opening moments where the game's stealth mechanics work well. Throughout the rest of the game, stealth becomes less and less of an option, perhaps intentionally, We'll talk about this further in the review, but know that the stealth mechanic is not well thought out. If anything, it should only be saved for this section. It's past this point where the game begins treading familiar ground. After a bizarre and tonally inappropriate chase sequence involving an ambulance, Sebastian finds himself lost in the blackness of a forest, with no familiar faces to be seen. After walking for a bit, the game finally gifts Sebastian with a pistol. At this point, the Resident Evil game that The Evil Within in fact is finally rears its ugly head, and just in case the player didn't know this was a Resident Evil game by now. Moving on, Sebastian continues traveling through the forest until he finally comes across a small shack. Opening the shack, Sebastian is seemingly sucked into a mirror and wakes up to find himself in a hospital clinic. Maybe. He meets a sexy nurse who, unsurprisingly, provides little answers. She insists that we sit in his chair, and we do. I mean, why not? After this traumatic event, the player is reinserted into the forest. You'll return to that clinic, however, as it marks the Evil Within's rendition of a hub world. It's a place where you can save your game, upgrade Sebastian's abilities, and unlock doors with keys you find throughout the adventure. I have mixed feelings about the hub world. In one case, it's a little unnecessary, as I don't see why we need a completely separate area to upgrade and level up when the game already makes rooms for us to teleport to the hub world. Why not just put all the stuff in those rooms? Or perhaps simply render the unlockables and upgrading to a side menu, something simpler or faster. On the other hand, Mikami does some pretty interesting things with the hub world, often setting up scares within the world where you feel most safe. So be warned, the hub world is just as untrustable as the world outside its walls. I'll give the hub world a pass, but it still remains cumbersome to always need to revert back to this world, just to save. As Sebastian is sent back to the forest, he comes across some villagers. We then see something evil take over these residents. What it is remains uncertain throughout the game. These aren't zombies and they aren't the infected citizens of Resident Evil 4. They appear to be embodied by evil, which turns out to be much worse. These are the main enemies of the Evil Within, and they mark an improvement over the enemies of previous Resident Evil games, even Resident Evil 4. The main reason revolves in how these enemies truly defy human characteristics. They are evil. More evil than zombies. So evil that shooting half of their face off will not kill them. The headshot has always been an important aspect in Resident Evil games, usually signifying the weak spot. Resident Evil 4 played on this by responding to a headshot with a massive parasite sprouting from the enemy's shoulders. The Evil Within plays on this further with much better results. The parasite's heads in Resident Evil 4 were a clever idea for creating tension, but it heavily dissuaded the player from wanting to take headshots if more bullets would need to be spent on killing the parasite. So, in the Evil Within, a headshot will usually result in only a portion of the enemy's head being blown off. And this creates added challenge and tension by creating a smaller target, but doesn't feel pointless because it's one step closer to the complete destruction of the head, which is by far the weakest point of the enemy's body. It's a natural advancement that just makes sense. In Resident Evil 4, headshots carry some sort of risk to them, but they don't needlessly take in several bullets for no reason. Instead, the player's skill in shooting determines how many bullets are spent. It's at this point where we see the Evil Within at its best, with mechanics and design working together near flawlessly. The biggest thing that stands out about these early levels is their relative open design. After escaping the forest, Sebastian finds himself in a small village. Each combat scenario opens Sebastian to neighborhoods throughout the village where the player can approach the enemies in whatever way they want, including stealth. I said earlier that stealth in the Evil Within only really works in the first area of the game, and I still stand by that in the sense that stealth is necessary for that section, but it does decrease over time. In this open area, however, the Evil Within allows the player to tackle the situation in whatever way he chooses. However, seeing as the player has a definite lack of ammo at the start, stealth will most likely be set option. For me, this is how the Evil Within should be throughout its entire runtime. A game that strongly encourages stealth because of the severe lack of bullets, but the bullets that the player does have instead should be used for when stealth fails. In order for this design to work, each area must be open and varied the same way that the European town is in the beginning. Sadly, the Evil Within doesn't want to be this, and instead it slowly moves away from it as time progresses. If I had to summarize Evil Within, I would say that it's a stealth game that quickly morphs into a survival horror shooter and then proceeds to continue morphing into a horror action game. So by the end of The Evil Within, stealth is not only unwise, it's just not allowed. Enemies always know where you are to start because most likely you are being ambushed. The endgame doesn't feature bad gameplay, but it's not near as interesting or engaging as in the forest section. In fact, I found the game to abandon its stealth elements so much to the point of being humorous. The final boss battle of The Evil Within is absolutely ridiculous, where in one part you are firing a 50 caliber machine gun from a Humvee, which is being violently thrown around by a giant flesh monster. In a Bayonetta game, this would be okay, but it completely contradicts the tone of the game's beginning, making the whole thing seem laughable. Even worse, the excellent atmosphere that The Evil Within creates in the beginning is also completely discarded when a more action-based gameplay design is introduced. There's truly a general tension to just sneaking around the village in The Evil Within. In the latter half of the game, you never feel this again, except in the mansion sequence, which seems to be a quick recap of what The Evil Within could have been before throwing the player into more ambushes. I don't want people taking me wrong though, the combat in The Evil Within is much better than the stealth, so I can't say where the game moves away from it because they probably didn't like the shallowness of the stealth mechanic in the first place. I still don't agree with getting rid of it completely the way they do, however, but I understand where Mikami and his team were coming from. And besides, sneaking isn't really Mikami's style. As I stated before, Mikami wanted to bring back classic survival horror with The Evil Within. He didn't want to make a modern survival horror game. What he means by this is simply that the horror is coming from a different place. Instead of scaring you with a complete absence of power, Mikami gives the player a small amount of power and asks him to do a lot with it. All Resident Evil games have lived off of this design ideology. Players in Resident Evil are slowly swarmed by their enemies. We can see them coming to kill us a mile away. What's scary about it is that all our actions to prevent this don't stop it. So we slowly feel that doom is descending upon us. It's a claustrophobic type of horror that the Resident Evil games became known for. The Evil Within continues this type of design and pulls it off quite well, or at least better than the last few Resident Evil games. Resident Evil 4 is exactly like The Evil Within, just with no poorly thought out stealth mechanic to bog the whole thing down. Besides that, I think The Evil Within practically copies Resident Evil 4's design while adding in some nice changes and adjustments to keep it from feeling dated. One way in which The Evil Within does this is through granting the player more mobility. In Resident Evil 4, moving a character was always a challenge. Part of this was intentional to make the player feel more vulnerable. Mikami didn't want the player to see behind him unless he completely turned around, so he locked the camera behind him on a 180-degree axis. While I respect this design decision and even agree with it to many points, I still think that The Evil Within giving the player full control of the camera works out much better for the player because frankly, Resident Evil's camera controls feel dated. However, Mikami did still do something with the camera, which is probably the most controversial aspect of the game. When you play The Evil Within, you are locked into a widescreen aspect ratio. This means that black bars at the top and bottom will cover the screen at all times. As almost everyone already knows, this is how many films are presented, but it's something that is practically never seen with games. Many people complained about the black bars because it took away from the player's vision. I understand where these people are coming from, but I also understand what Mikami was trying to do, which could possibly be two things. One reason may be he wanted to improve the game's performance by reducing the pixel number, or two, he wanted to limit the player's field of vision and increase the sense of claustrophobia. Personally, I like the second reason because that's the effect it had on me. I think that means that the true game renders a greater field of vision, but then covers it with the black bars, instead of it just being an artificially created smaller screen like most people think. The game actually seems to be cutting off sections of the screen, which scrunches the player's field of vision. This made the game far more claustrophobic and as a result, effective. The other component introduced is the crossbow. The crossbow is a great idea. With it, the player is given a wide variety of options to approach a battle, whether he would like to set up a mine trap or blind the enemies with flash bolts. You can even use it as a crossbow. These bolts can be crafted from parts found on dead enemies and traps, which encourages scavenging. Personally, I spent most of my parts on frost bolts because they were extremely effective against wiping out groups of basic enemies, which then allowed me to save my ammo for my other guns on bosses. And I'm glad I did, because the bosses in The Evil Within, like the rest of the game really, are quite hard. If you're familiar with the Resident Evil series, then you will know that the bosses in those games tend to be extremely difficult. Many times it seems fruitless to shoot bosses in Resident Evil because it seemingly has no effect, and sometimes the game doesn't expect you to fight the boss at all. However, bosses in Resident Evil series have always been a mixed bag for me as far as quality is concerned, and I feel the same way with The Evil Within. Some of the bosses are well done, like the Spider-Woman and the man with a safe for a head. Both of these bosses make the enemies invincible to conventional methods of fighting, and instead the player needs to think about how to defeat it. Other bosses, like this dog, seem extremely poorly thought out. I mention the dog in particular because it's easily the worst boss in the game. I like the idea of being forced to pay attention to the movement of the brush and waiting for the dog to strike. But there are 4 bushes. That's it. It almost feels like a joke that this dog actually thinks he's hidden when I watched him run into that bush and not move. What's worse is that you don't have to beat it. This makes no sense, really. When I figured this out, I promised that any subsequent playthroughs would result in me using the least amount of ammunition as possible. Since the bosses, like every encounter in the game, are supposed to drain the player's ammo, this is bad design. Then the game makes you go back in to get Joseph's glasses, acting like this is a bad thing. But since the boss is a complete pushover, you do it like it's nothing. One boss, however, stands out above all others in how well it is designed. I'm talking about the Amalgam Alpha, this ladder boss which you need to fight in a parking ramp. For one, it's an overwhelming enemy simply by its size. There are bigger bosses in Evil Within, but this is the only large boss that doesn't put you in a special set piece like a bus or a Humvee. This leaves the player feeling outmatched, which is exactly what a good boss should do. What truly impressed me about the boss, though, is the variety of ways he can be defeated. If you're so inclined, you can step toe-to-toe with this boss and kill him, but the boss actively hunts you, so you can defeat this boss without even being seen. Or you can take an approach in the middle, which involves stash and blast tactics. This is literally the only boss where stealth or straight-up action actually work, which is good because it exists, but also bad because it's the only one that exists. I think the bosses also help put into context another aspect that Mikami clearly wanted to incorporate into The Evil Within. As I stated before, The Evil Within marks Mikami's attempt to bring back classic survival horror, but it's also much more than that. In many ways, it's a celebration of the games that define classic survival horror, and I'm not just talking about Resident Evil, which clearly has the most influence. For example, I also found that Silent Hill had a particular influence over many enemies. When the player completes the game, he can read up on each enemy and discover that each one actually represented a different part of Ruvik's tormented mind. The Silent Hill series is known for confronting the players with enemies that are symbolic in their design. In other words, certain characteristics about what they look like or how they act can actually give insight into the story, instead of the enemies just being scary for horror's sake. Evil Within also tries to do this by making each enemy a damaged part of the mind you play in. When I first faced off against this little monstrosity, it seemed like nothing else than a ripoff of the Fear franchise. But as the game progressed and I learned more about her and what the game was trying to do, the more I began to see that it was probably clearly taking from that franchise. But it was more as a homage than anything else. You can see this in several enemies throughout the game. The Keeper is playing Pyramid Head, the final boss looks like Nemesis, and of course Lisa looks like Alma. I think the main reason then for having the entire game take place in someone's head really makes sense if you want to pay homage to a genre, especially when visiting classic survival horror locations. The Evil Within pretty much fills every single checkmark for what is now called cliché horror settings, and the game makes no logical sense in how it sends you from each location. But being that this is the mind of a madman, that's okay. So it allows for the game to play like a greatest hits of horror vignettes without the plot feeling too nonsensical. It's not like it feels like the same old garbage we've been fed for years. A lot of these locations are cleverly designed with twists on the expected look of each location. Many of these locations create a dense and terrifying atmosphere. Sadly, this excellent design is poorly utilized in context with the game's narrative. I think most people by now almost universally agree that The Evil Within's plot is extremely poor. However, I don't play Shinji Mikami games for their story. In fact, most of his games' plots are usually bland, but The Evil Within may mark his lowest point as a storyteller. For one, the game's central character, Sebastian Castellanos, is possibly one of the most bland characters I've seen in a horror game. The main problem with Sebastian is that he is completely oblivious to what is going on around him. As the cunning detective is faced with the world's most terrifying beast of a madman's mind, Castellanos usually manages to give a hint of irritation most of the time. I don't know if this may be a result of bad dubbing, but the voice acting of Castellanos' character is dry and monotone. I don't expect Castellanos to be shitting his pants when he faces off against these monsters, but the reactions they do give him are so stupid that they come off as comedic.
Seems someone wants me hospitalized.
The rest of the supporting cast is just as uninteresting. You spend a fair amount of time with Joseph Oda throughout the game, and during none of that time do you really get to find out more about him as a person. Ray Kidman's character seemed just as bland up until the very end, but the game purposefully holds out on giving her character's actions context for future DLC. I could go over the entire cast, but the point is that you just don't care about anyone. However, I say this in retrospect because The Evil Within does build up its mystery quite well in the beginning. When first starting the game, I found myself intrigued with finding out what was going on and where exactly I was. The game slowly unveils information intelligently, actually, and I immediately started making predictions on how Castellanos' past with his wife and child connected to the overall story. I began analyzing the possible metaphorical meanings the enemies held, and I made honest evaluations at possible plot twists. Now, with that said, you could probably imagine my disappointment when all that intrigue builds up to really nothing. In truth, Castellanos' backstory has nothing to do with the main narrative. It's simply window dressing to give the illusion that Castellanos is more complex than he actually is. There isn't a single moment in the game where we actually see Castellanos make some meaningful connection or mention of his past. All we know is he is a drunk, and Joseph wants him to stop drinking. If Castellanos is fighting depression of losing his wife and child, then there's absolutely no resolution to this. To make this worse, the metaphorical symbols that the enemies represent are either obvious or way too abstract. All of this culminates to an ending that feels inherently unsatisfying. I'm all for abstract endings that challenge the audience, but let's consider this for a minute. The most popular theory out there currently is that Ruvik has taken over the mind of Leslie, and it's him that we see walking away at the end of the game. This is assumed because Leslie is rendered into liquid at the end of the level of the game. There isn't much else to go off of this, but for argument's sake, let's say it's correct. If Ruvik is still alive, this would mean that the developers are clearly gearing up for a sequel. However, Shinji Mikami has stated several times that this would be his last game he would develop for The Evil Within. If this is true, what Mikami has done is create a project that he intentionally meant to leave in someone else's hands. Personally, I think this is irresponsible, and it works towards the detriment of the game because it didn't need an obtuse ending. Endings of this nature usually work because they involve rich stories with layers of detail that allow the viewers to assemble the answers for themselves. The Evil Within is devoid of subtlety, so the answer that has been accepted is one that naturally is based off of very little supporting evidence. Add to that the game's director is leaving the project after this game, which means that the story's direction could literally go anywhere, making the ending of the first game completely pointless. If you think about it, there's literally nothing stopping the new director of the franchise from never showing us Ruvik or Sebastian for that matter ever again. I understand that Mikami did not write The Evil Within, but a new director could follow in Resident Evil's footsteps by creating a sequel that has brand new characters. So instead of getting a complete story, we were handed a setup to a franchise that can never answer our questions. And honestly, I wouldn't care too much because whatever conspiracy exists within this world doesn't interest me. But that doesn't mean that The Evil Within doesn't interest me. In fact, I'm interested to see what exactly comes next from this franchise, if it becomes a franchise at all. I hope it does because The Evil Within is a good game, and it could be even better. Currently, The Evil Within stands as probably the sole torchbearer of survival horror games based off of classic design elements. When it all comes down to it, what that basically means is that you can shoot and kill your enemies. I'll probably never be scared by that sort of design near as much as something like Amnesia scares me, but I still think that games like The Evil Within tend to be more entertaining. If someone asked me if I thought Shinji Mikami succeeded in bringing classic survival horror back, I would probably say we'll have to wait and see. I would say that Mikami made a pretty good game though. In all honesty, that's probably the best he can do.